Welcome to the ODP Cast, the podcast all things ODP. With this podcast, we will attempt to inspire and educate and hopefully get a few laughs along the way. We'll be covering many different topics relating to the profession, such as what's new, some around education, some around research, and many, many more. We'll also be doing some reaction videos to some of the funny videos that we've seen on the internet, so make sure to follow us on YouTube so that you can see what we see. Tune in to get updates, get involved by following us are at ODP Show across all major social media platforms, and remember to save this podcast to keep up to date with myself and our many guests as we add a little Yorkshire twang to the fantastic profession that is operating department practice. Hi, welcome to episode 5 of the ODP Cast, and today's episode we're going to be covering ODPs working outside of the perioperative environment. I'll give you 60 seconds to think.
Or different roles that you can take on that don't necessarily use your clinical skills but use the other skills that you've gained.
I think I meet your person spec, apart from I'm not a nurse and I'm not NMC registered. I'm an ODP and I'm HCPC registered.
We take for granted some of the weird and wonderful things we do in theatre.
And then be able to utilise that knowledge to support patients.
We're excellent at being process driven. We're excellent at following checklists. And that.
Wait, can you take that? And really, the sky's the
I
limit.
think people just naturally want to get better and improve.
My next question is we move on to where do you see ODPs working in the future?
Looking at the skills that we have, looking at the skills that we have got, and how we can then apply that to other areas.
Theatre, because it's so normalised to us that actually sometimes having that inside knowledge can be helpful elsewhere.
No sleep. Club. Another club.
I went to lying around podcast, Chris.
To start off, what sort of careers do you know of? What advice would you give to an ODP looking at applying for an opportunity that's outside of that perioperative environment?
Just go for it. So when people say an ODP can't do that, they say, why not? Be bold and be brave and a little bit strategic. As a profession, we need to change that narrative. Yes, we can do it, and this is how we're doing it. They can only say no, can't they? And then you can ask why.
Start from this point.
Hi, welcome to episode 5 of the ODP Cast. And today's episode, we're going to be covering ODPs working outside of the perioperative environment. So we've got some fantastic guests joining us today. Some of them are familiar faces in previous episodes. Guest number 1, reveal yourself.
Hi, I'm Ben. I'm a lecturer at Sheffield Hallam, currently lecturing in paramedic science, but I've got an ODP background, and I think you were all stuck with me for the Christmas episode.
I'm Jenny, senior lecturer in operating department practice at Sheffield Hallam University.
And I'm Joe. I'm a lecturer in operating department practice at SHU.
So thank you so much for joining me. So January 2025, how was everybody's new year?
Crazy. Just wild. That was it.
Stayed in. Quite long. Very little alcohol.
You stayed in?
Stayed in.
Well,
I went to lying around podcast, Chris.
I don't go out partying like I used to, I'm telling you.
Well, I say we don't go out. We just go to friends' houses we take it. It's like a rolling rota. We go to people's houses and have house parties every year. But yeah,
we don't believe in queuing or spending money.
No.
Oh, the queues sometimes.
No.
Oh my
not
God.
about that.
The worst queues I've seen is last year. I went to Pride, a couple of different Pride events, and the queue, they just don't have enough bars. The queues are ridiculous. You sat waiting. One time, we bought a case because we're like, I'm not going back. I'm going to buy multiple drinks. I'm not going back. But no, it was a quiet one. What about you, Joe? What did you do for New Year?
Busy. 2 small children. No sleep. I'm as happy as can be.
Yeah.
You know what?
When
you said that no sleep there, all I got is Lady Gaga, no sleep, club, another club, playing, no sleep.
That's it. That's Joe's life.
I'm not lying. That's my life.
Yeah.
Well, it's nice. I mean, 2025, did anyone make any New Year's resolutions?
I never do because I never stick to them.
Never stick to them.
No.
I'll throw one in. Try and get a little bit more sleep than Joe.
It's not difficult. It's not difficult. It's all good. And if I'm not sleeping, I'll get myself up early. Nah, just carry on the way that we are, because we're all legends.
During this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to cover the topic of ODPs working outside of the perioperative environment. So just a little recap on where ODPs predominantly work, are your three main areas: your anaesthetics, your surgery, and your recovery, that we sort of covered in episode 1, really. But what other areas can ODPs work in outside of those? What's everybody's experience as an ODP outside of the main areas?
So I'm aware that I've got friends and colleagues that have worked in other aspects. So like gentleman we used to work with was in resus officer for previously, came back to theatres with for a bit of time, went back to work in resus, and over the clinicians that have had substantive roles in A&E as part of resus teams and and wider A&E teams. I mean, I've got currently another role outside of the standard remit for practice, and we can come on and talk about that a little bit if of interest at all, but it's not that interesting. But how about you guys? Anyone else?
I suppose just mostly see other ODPs working in acute areas in hospitals is like a key one, but then you see them doing pre-op assessments, you see them working in different clinics, a lot of the so there's various different places that ODPs can end up and work in, and the scope is only getting bigger really since the pandemic. Don't know if any of you remember pandemic. Yeah, remember the pandemic? I think you've heard of it. Ever since then, there's been a lot more spotlight shined on the ODP role, and that meant that a lot more areas become more open to it, and a lot more jobs became available because of the scope of practice that we had. Meant it was a lot more flexible to go into certain areas.
I think really important thing to say is how important the day-to-day job, i.e. perceived day-to-day job is. And although that we discuss lots of different avenues out of theatre, that actually I think a lot of people professions are probably quite envious that we do work in theatre. So I think that's probably a good starting point to sort of work from. And then of course, so like I think me, Jenny and Ben, we were all qualified at a very similar time, weren't we? Sort of around 2011. I think Ben, you before Ben.
Yeah.
Ben's a bit older, he's got a few more greys.
Just a couple.
But even in that length of time, so what's like 13 years, I think one of the first things that we saw, we've alluded to, the pre-op practitioner. And I worked at I trained at one of the hospitals where they had one of the very first pre-op ODPs. And yeah, we could list off all the different roles that people have done or we know of people doing. But I think my biggest push in relation to this episode would be about not being limited to a job title. Primary example of that is my role on critical care transport for paediatric and neonates was advertised as a staff nurse. But when you look deeper at the person spec, the job description, it was literally a case with the nurse manager like calling them up and saying, look, I think I meet your person spec, apart from I'm not a nurse and I'm not an MC registered. I'm an ODP and I'm HCPC registered. And we talk about COVID, and that's been the sort of catalyst for giving ODPs the confidence to sort of look at these other avenues. And I don't think there's a lot of negative press out in relation to the news, in relation to pay, in relation to working conditions. And actually, most of the theatre departments that I've been in on more recently, that's less of the case. I think people are just wanting to expand and progress as natural human curiosity. So I don't think it's a negative thing, and there is a lot of the other end of the string, so to speak, people saying, why are we not just happy working in theatres doing what we're doing? And I don't think it's that at all. I think people just naturally want to get better and improve, and find new opportunities.
I think like you mentioned, Joe, the progression in the time that we've been in practice is insane. Like I remember my my interview for uni, one of the questions was, what does registration mean to us? Because it was still a new thing at that point. And it's like, well, actually, if you look at what's changed and how rapidly our profession's advanced in recent years, it's crazy and it is amazing. But it's where we're now at that next T junction of where it goes and what those avenues are. And this is where these new roles are coming out. Like when I first got into practice, it was long term, what do you want to do? You could be, you know, quality on the shop floor, or you can go down an education or a management route. You've got to, you know, almost pick your three of the two. You either stay clinical, you go into management, or you go into education, and they're the three options you had. And there was no conversation around going anywhere else with it. And then the surgical first assistant role came out, and that kind of started to branch out into those advancing roles. And then obviously we had Brian on the other day. We've got the AA, but these were still very niche, and one in a few of us went down these pathways, whereas now lots of different scopes come up. And as you mentioned, like COVID, I think similar to what you said, it gave a springboard, one, for us to be seen in different lights and to be seen outside of the mold. But I think for us as practitioners, for us to work in somewhere to show us we can do something different or can apply these skills somewhere else. Because I think sometimes we're victims of our own security blanket with that. And
I think what Joe was saying is the key here is that not being bound by the title of operations department practice. And I know that's a whole different conversation to have around, you know, is that still relevant first? But I think looking at the skills that we have, looking at the skills that we have got and how we can then apply that to other areas. The job that I had before I became a lecturer was not advertised for an ODP. It was a HCPC registrant, but it was not around theatres, and ODP wasn't even thought of until I applied for it, because it was something that was relevant that I could definitely do. So, you know, that's the thing, is not thinking, oh, if I become an ODP, the only place I can possibly work is in an operating theatre, because that's just not the case.
It's so true. I mean, I know of individuals that have worked in pre-op. I know of an ODP now that works on theatre admissions unit, like what was effectively a nursery. But it's just having that opportunity to be able to use your skills effectively and use them in a different environment, because what you can do is you can apply them. It's transferable. So that leads me to my next question. Why do you think ODPs are useful outside of theatres? What specific transferable skills do we have that we can use in these environments? I'll give you 60 seconds to think.
I think we've got a lot of transferable skills. There's obviously the clinical based ones that we have, you know, the airway skills, working with ventilators, machinery, different bits of equipment, you know, all various different things with that. There's the, like, what are known as like the nursing skills of doing observations and looking after patients in recovery and dealing with post-nausea and vomiting and all that kind of stuff as well. But there's also the team working factors, the human factors elements of it. You know, we're having to work quite closely with multiple different professions, so then the communication elements of being able to manage situations. We're working with very vulnerable people, and not just in case of like vulnerable characteristics, but also vulnerable in a time in their life where, you know, they're either very poorly. There's a reason why they're coming through theatres, and it's never, very rarely is it a positive experience. Obviously there are a few times where it is a positive experience, or they're coming in for a change that they've been wanting for a while, but like most of the time it is because they are so unwell that is the final option for them, is to come through surgery. So you know, having that skills of being able to deal with those elements of sort of patients and those different demographics is so transferable to a lot of different places in and outside of clinical skills. Because we talked a lot actually about like acute care in hospitals and like different areas, but there's also a lot of external to that, or different roles that you can take on that don't necessarily use your clinical skills, but use the other skills that you've gained.
I think one of the main ones is like even just down to like the knowledge that you have, especially in that pre-operative environment, because there are individuals that might work in that pre-operative setting that haven't even stepped foot or been seen an operation happening, so can like say like what they think would happen or what they're told to happen, but then to have someone that understands the perioperative journey and then be able to utilize that knowledge to support patients in that preoperative setting, is it just shows how we can then take that knowledge that we've already got and apply it into one setting, and then you can apply that into multiple settings. So just as it applies to pre-op, it will also apply to the likes of the theatre admissions unit and so
Yeah. I think there's been times in my career that having that understanding, that underpinning has really helped me help patients. So having conversation around starvation times without having an understanding of, well, why is this vital? Why is it important? When you can then go into that further discussion of, well, this is the justification, this is why we think this is why we ask this. Because we take for granted some of the weird and wonderful things we do in theatre because it's so normalized to us that actually sometimes having that inside knowledge can be helpful elsewhere. I think the other thing is we normalize some very outside of the box situations. Like we're involved in some things that a lot of people can't practice in a controlled environment. We control very well. So like I did a lot of work with major blood loss, and we managed it in a very controlled, as controlled as it can be, but a controlled situation. We got very normalized to it, which that can be applied to all sorts of even pre-hospital care really well, where they haven't had the opportunity potentially to do it in a controllable situation. That when you start applying things that you can tailor things, you can adjust things, you can make small adjustments in theatre that you can't necessarily do when you've got all the different variables outside of theatre at play. So I think sometimes that, and then the team dynamics, I think is something that's really valuable from an ODP perspective, that we work in such a multidisciplinary environment so effectively most of the time. And also we don't think about it. It's second nature to us. It's bred into the culture within theatre across all the disciplines we work in, and the way the hierarchy works so effectively, how we can flatten it, especially with the changes that have happened in recent years with the integration of human factors and the WHO, and how we have all those systems in play. It's become second nature to us that you can then apply those to a lot of situations that are in the less controlled scenarios, and that practitioner's skill set becomes really valuable. And I think that's just because of the nature of the pandemic and what it pushed for people to be outside of their normal scopes or normal roles, not scopes. It meant that those other characters and those other bits were actually seen in others. I don't know, waffling a bit.
No, I think there's some really good points there, and you're absolutely right. I think that what we effectively can do is really, as I say, I'm probably revisiting a point that I've already said, but we can apply that to many different environments, and I think that is the key here in relation to those skills. So my next question is we move on to, where do you see ODPs working in the future? Because if you'd have asked me this question 10 years ago, I'd have probably said something around the lines of preoperative assessment, but now that's happened. What's next? Where do you see ODPs in the future?
Space. No, I'm joking.
SpaceX.
SpaceX, man. On Mars.
Well, hey, when we start living there in these hospitals,
Exactly.
On a genuine serious point, because we're all good at being serious, in theatres, and I know that sounds like an obvious one, but we've got an all-time high waiting list. We have got plans coming out of the ears, if you go off anything by the news, in terms of how we're going to tackle this. We've got satellite sites popping up all over the country. We've got all different ways of working, and by working I mean in terms of how we're going to get that waiting list target down, because the bottom line is the surgery brings in income for the trusts, and the waiting list is probably on the, I'd venture a guess at top 10 in terms of priorities on the government's list at the moment. So actually I think that we will see a lot more back in theatres, because I think that's where the investment's going to be. And it sort of brings me on to my other point, although Chris interrupted, didn't let me have a chat on last question. I know you noticed, Jenny.
Yes, I did notice. That is fine. It's no problem.
But it's fine. It's fine. But I think it fits nicely because we talk about what transferable skills we've got going into other roles, but actually the other roles also supplement our role, if that makes sense. We're excellent at being process driven. We're excellent at following checklists, and that were one of the main things that really helped on transport, because obviously everything is a process. But certain roles, I can only go off my own experience, and you guys might mimic in terms of the more managerial roles or education roles. But there's certain things that I did in sort of operational management in surgical division, so to speak. Long story short is waiting list management that massively impacted the way that I viewed my day-to-day work in an operating theatre, and gave me massive kind of, not advantage, but in terms of knowledge base and what I understand about how lists are planned and what the waiting list means and what it actually means for patients, the impact that has. And actually my prediction is that we're going to see an influx going the other way at some point. We're probably on a tipping scale at the minute, because generally in the NHS the direction is people are jumping out, but we've already seen a pay rise. I think there's going to be more investment. We've got not so new, but we've got different methods of training for all professions, not just for ODPs. That's going to have heavy investment and bring with it interest. So I think that the scale's going to tip the other way, and what we're going to see is that it becomes a desirable place to work. Be that due to wage, be that due to flexibility, be that whatever opportunity for further developments. But I think that's going to be the trajectory that we're on. I do like the idea of these sort of satellite sites, and I think with that will bring the requirement for having senior or more senior practitioners within them roles, because they're going to be sort of isolated a little bit from a major trust. So yeah, that was my point.
No, I think there's some really good points that you make there, and I think you're absolutely right, because from my sort of viewpoint anyway, is like theatres and surgery holds like such an important place in my heart that I think I got into this because I loved the idea of surgery. So I think that then like it will always be this special place for me, even though like I've taken a different route into education. It's where I'm at in education in relation to what I teach, because I love the profession. I love what the actual job is. I think it's just like how that can then feed into other roles. So I think one of the ones that sort of popped into my mind originally was like, and I could be wrong, because there probably is individuals that are filling these roles, but like like those specialist roles related to specific surgeries or specific specialities. So you might have like a specialist spine nurse or a specialist gastro nurse or something like that. I think that potentially a future role, which I reckon there probably are ODPs that are already filling. Off the top of my head, I don't know of any, but there will be some out there. But I think that's potentially a big future, managing especially because the perioperative journey isn't anaesthetics to recovery. It's beyond that. It's the pre-op bit. It's the right from GP right to discharge. And I think that we can then fill in some other roles outside of those three main roles. And I think that that's one of the future ones that chances are people are already doing. But
I think there's niche aspects where people are doing it. So like I'm aware of previous practitioners being involved in things like liver transplant coordination, stuff like that, some of that organ kind of related stuff. But again, they're very niche roles. And I think the more it happens, and like you said, that the more the demand increases, the more we'll get ODPs established in it. And I think it does take some ODPs to be trailblazing some of these things. Some will work, some won't. There needs to be a need for it, and there needs to be the right people going into that at the time to make it established. I'm aware that all of us we've all worked in niche parts of the profession as well, and kind of tested the waters on things and bits and bobs. I remember when I was working for a previous organisation, so an ambulance trust, and they were talking about the possibility of AHP practitioners because they were working on a nurse practitioner role. But again, it became kind of a, well, we have you working in the trust as the first AHP, so that might be an avenue. And unfortunately, I then left. But it takes another one to be in that position in the right. It's a lot of it's about timing, place, and need, I think. But I think Joe's right. I think there is going to be a massive push for good quality staff back in the heart and soul roles. Like I say, I work with a lot of pre-hospital stuff now, and there's definitely a massive transferable level of skill there. But do we need ODPs in that role at the minute? Probably not as much as we need them in theatre. And what do we need? Shortages. Again, it all comes back to some of the conversations we had. We mentioned with Brian in the anaesthetic associate role, when the PE role, the physician assistant role came out. A lot of it depends on national need and shortfalls maybe elsewhere. It's probably a better way of putting it than that. But I think, as Joe's highlighted, that maybe the shortfall is going to actually come in theatre. The need might actually be back on our doorstep.
Some of that also might be recognition of the profession as well. I think as ODP start to grow and as these opportunities do come up, with more workloads as we the plan to reduce waiting lists, what we might find is that the profession continues to grow because it has been growing over years, and we are becoming more recognised now, and people are now knowing what an ODP is. I mean, sometimes I will have conversations with someone new and they know what an ODP is, or they know roughly what it is, and I think that as that happens, that will then start to fill those gaps, shall we say, because there will be a massive amount of people that will want to train to work in theatres as from a recruitment point of view at within my role. Like, I meet so many people that just want to work in theatres, that didn't know what they could even do that as a career option. But then I think it's all about then, but yes, we train these individuals at university to do this specific job and this set of skills, and it's all about like, well, wait, can you take that? And really, the sky's the limit, because so many people have done so.
Well, that's it. I think that's why a lot of places now are implementing things like preceptorship programs and career pathways and additional training plans and stuff like that, because they are then going through those processes through that and then developing themselves into whatever they kind of were aiming for to begin with. And I think that's where a lot of the things like the degree apprenticeships come into it as well, because these are people that might not be able to get to university for one reason or another through the normal routes, so then are going through the degree apprenticeship. So it's that growing your own from the starting point and getting, like Joe was saying, staff through theatres, into theatres, and building on careers within that and putting more time investment within that.
I think one of the things that I've seen in my time, I'm sure we're all aware of it. I know that we were in our cohorts, we were all probably on the minority of the younger side of the generation that were doing it. When I did mine, it was something that a lot of people came to as a second role. They didn't know what the role was until they'd worked in theatres themselves or knew someone that done it, or came to it as a second career. Like my dad was an ODP. That's how I knew it existed, but he came to it later in life. And a lot of people used to do that, which I think has made a generation of people that have got longer in the career. And that's not to say that if you do it at a later date, you're not going to be in it for a long period of time or anything like that. But I think it then gives scope to where do you want to advance the role, where do you want to take yourself, what do you want to do. Like, not to say that if you start later it's going to be different. My dad started in his 30s and became a surgical first assistant and a union rep and all sorts of weird and wonderful, but it just sounds like he didn't ever keep a job for very long, really, when I think about it. But he did. It was all for only a couple of trusts. But you can progress with the role, and if you've got time to be able to find these niches, find these areas, start to push that kind of where the profession goes, you've got time to invest in it, I think. And I think as we start to get new generations through that are taking health careers across the board of healthcare earlier on in their lives, it means that they've got time for that kind of progression and that kind of push.
I think this is a thing, is the prospect of spending 40, 45 years in one department maybe daunt some people. And like you say, the shift So when I trained, there was me and I think 2 others who were straight from school, 6th form. Everybody else was a mature student. And yeah, you know, some people entered the profession and only had, you know, 20, 30 years until they were retiring, as opposed to that length of time.
My final question then is, what do you think limits us from working outside of the perioperative environment? What barriers do you think there are to ODPs fulfilling these roles where we potentially have some skills that can apply to them?
I think what we've already discussed, and that's the need of ODPs in theatres. And that's not to say that that's it. Once you get in there, you're going to be stuck and you're never going to leave again. But I think the need and the driving force at the moment is for ODPs to remain in theatres and to work through the waiting lists and everything else that we've got going on. So I think that's probably potentially one of the barriers. But again, most trusts now are putting in 5-year plans, and they have to give you a career pathway, and you know, they have to be talking about these progression options for you. So it's not like that's it. It's just that there's a potential that things might slow down a little bit while we build up the reserves that we need, basically. I think that's probably possibly one of the barriers.
I think it will, and it will. It sort of lends itself to not being a barrier, because as that develops, as practice develops, you know, you look at things that have happened over the last, I don't know, got to say 10, 20 years. You've got things like robotic surgery, which requires specialist staff. You've got, I've had experience of working in minimally invasive cardiac surgery, you know, like valve change, which, you know, if you tell somebody who doesn't understand the prospect of surgery that you can have one of your valves in your heart changed through a tiny incision that's big, and how much more is that going to develop? And if we are pushing the boundaries of care, we have aging population with more and more complex illnesses. It was only the other day I was doing a theatre list, and I was discussing with the anaesthetist who was talking about their elective lists being that nobody's ASA grade under grade 3 because of this and the aging population, and their requirements and what they need are different. And does that then lend, you know, rewind 20 years and the prospect of having somebody with the experience like what Brian's got would have been a bit of a well, people would have probably shunned it. But what other roles is that gonna bring along? So you know, you look at different ways of working. I know of different people who are in roles that are related to efficiency, for example, and theatre efficiency, and that requires somebody who's got the experience to work in theatres. And it's looking at that, and what the demand will grow as practice changes, as the population changes, as healthcare itself changes. But yeah, ultimately the bottom line is where do we need the most of our ODPs, and it's in theatre. Not, you know, not trying to push. We don't need all of our ODPs that qualify going off and being an anaesthesia associate, because it's poor use of a workforce.
I think one of the other things, I'm just thinking when you talk about limiting factors, and I think personally what limited me is I've obviously gone into pre-hospital education now, and I've got a bit of a weird route about it. But if you'd have asked me 5 years ago if I'd have been doing this, I'd have told you I'd never left theatres. Like, that was what I wanted to do. That was my bread and butter. That's where I, you know, that's why I aspired to be. I enjoyed it. I might have tried to progress within theatres or gone down educational tangents. But I ended up going into education and then going from education to education for ambulance service, which then meant that I then saw that the transferable options. And it took me opening up my expectations of myself as a practitioner and the role. So I think one of the limiting factors are ourselves, or are our perceptions of the role. And I know at another point we're going to talk about the name and the association with, like, what does ODP mean? Is it correct? But I think sometimes we pigeonhole ourselves into those niches. When I was in practice, when I worked down south, I worked in a very niche type of surgery, did craniofacial and neurosurgery in pediatrics. It was very much, I was getting to a point where I was like, well, there aren't many places I can do this. But I convinced myself that was all I could do in the role. And it took a bit of timing, opportunity, and other different factors to put me into a position that I had to look at myself differently and the role differently. And now I spend a good portion of my life explaining why I work outside of the role because of the perceptions of the roles. So I think a lot of it is that perception, one ourselves, but also externally, what the perception of us as practitioners are. And I think it's changing, but I think it comes in line with culture change. When I first started in the role, if you wanted to work in anything other than theatres, the culture was negative towards that. Or if you're progressing, trying to push it somewhere else, there was a negative connotations around it. Whereas I think that's changed, and I think we've moved away from that, which, hopefully I think it's opening up to not necessarily everyone leaving. Like Joe says, there needs to be a good stock of decent quality practitioners in practice, but also opening up the scope of practice and what we can do within our role. Because fundamentally, the role has changed a lot. When I first went to get into it, I went into it because I had a logical mindset and I liked the idea of taking an anaesthetic machine apart. Those aspects of our role have changed with the change in technologies and equipment, and then different requirements of the job because of, like Joe said, some of the surgical advancements have changed. I think the job itself's changed, the culture we work in has changed, and I think the next thing to change is our perceptions in ourselves, because I think we're only limited by what we think we can do.
I think you touched on some really interesting points there. But I definitely think the one that really sticks out is that perception, and I think you're right. There's perception of ourselves, but also like the way that we're perceived by other professions and other areas. Because a lot of the perception is the fact that they don't understand us because they don't know what we do, and I think that then is a limiting factor.
I think it's a lack of perception.
Lack of perception.
That's the thing. It's and I don't want to use the only thing that popped into my head was brand awareness.
Yeah.
It's identity, it's professional awareness, it's being able to say I'm an ODP and people go, oh, I know what that is. But most people, even people within the healthcare world, you go, I'm an ODP, and they still go, oh, what's that then? And I think that's the lack of a perception is one of our biggest stumbling blocks.
And I think that will change with time as we do develop. But I do think that for at least a period of time, that will limit us in other roles because they won't see the value in what we do because they don't understand it.
Yeah, though it is improving. It is getting massively improved. Like, I can't even remember where we were. I can't remember who I was talking to now, but I was talking to someone and I said I'm an ODP, and they went, oh, right, okay. And then I was waiting for, so what's that then? And then I preempted and I was like, so work in operating theatres, and they were like, oh, yeah, I know. And I'm like, oh, do you? Oh yeah, that's nice. So it's that definitely is improving, and we are getting out there. But I think that's one of the things, and that's where that need for ODPs to push the boundaries and to apply for jobs that aren't for them, push for options to get out there, is where you'll end up getting. That's where things will start to improve.
Yeah. I think the prescribing thing might be an issue as well, because I know that there are some like the likes of ACP roles, advanced clinical practitioner roles, where they are open to HCPC registered AHPs, but because of the need for prescribing, they won't take ODPs. Yeah,
I think that's already starting to change, because that's already been discussed, and again the pandemic in some respects helped that massively, because there was this, all of a sudden there was this influx of people needing to have things like the COVID vaccine, and you had this workforce of people that could potentially be doing it, who were trained to do IM injections, but can't do them because we can't, or couldn't do them because we weren't sat under a PGD and we weren't able to prescribe. So then we just weren't able to do it.
I think it's going to take the push for us to get a prescriber will hopefully change the legal frameworks, like Section 17 we don't apply to, whereas a lot of other AHP professions do, which enable them to give appropriate drugs under that section, which is where a lot of our AHP colleagues can give certain medications within it. And we currently don't sit in that because we weren't considered within it, which is, again, I mean, me and Jenny were both working together when we found out we weren't able to be flu vaccine champions because we weren't covered to give a flu vaccine that we'd done all the appropriate training for and were equally skilled to do, because of the legal frameworks weren't there. And I think it eventually, hopefully, there'll be enough traction with that there will be a change in law that'll mean that our profession can grow again. It's quite a big stumbling block to be at, but it's only time.
ODP Interviews. So welcome to ODP Interviews. So I'm joined by a very special guest today, who I've known for, I don't want to say a long time, but a long time for me. I think I was actually reflecting on this before we started, and it's 10 years that I've known you now, known of you, Helen. 10 years.
Crazy, isn't it? Crazy.
10 years. So yeah, 10 years ago, I was being interviewed for my ODP post at Sheffield Hallam to study. So that's how long, because I started the September of 2014 as a student. So 10 years. It's been a while.
It has been a while. It has. And you know, actually, this September is 20 years since I started the programme. So
Wow.
I've definitely been around a little bit longer than 10 years. But yeah, a good 10 years that is, Chris.
So first of all, I'll let you introduce yourself properly. So
Sure.
do you want to give us like your introduction, your title, your name, anything you want to add?
Sure. Helen Lowes. I am an operating department practitioner, ODP. Just re-registered, obviously. It's our re-registration cycle this year. At the moment, my role, I've just come back to Sheffield Hallam University as an associate head. And as an associate head at the university, I am leading on practice-based learning. So anything around placements for not just ODP, but across the whole of the allied health professions and social care as well. So working alongside colleagues with nursing and midwifery, if I can say that again, working alongside colleagues in nursing and midwifery as well.
The topic of this podcast episode is working outside of the theatre environment. As I'm sure, as we covered a little bit in the previous episode, we talked about some of the routes that are available where ODPs can work outside of those environments and where they can utilise their skills effectively to support patient care. So to start off, what sort of careers do you know of that ODPs can complete outside of the perioperative environment?
I've been really fortunate, Chris, that in the roles that I've done, because I've not just worked at SHU, and I'll talk a little bit more about my career in a while. I've met so many different people from so many places across the country doing lots of different things. So from being in clinical roles, directly with our patients in theatres in peri-op, but thinking across kind of those 4 pillars of practice. So research and innovation, leadership, education, and clinical. I've been really privileged to meet so many people in the last couple of years. If people are on social media, they might have seen that the NHS has just signed a contract for LeafFix, which is an innovation by 2 ODPs. So I know those ODPs. They were just working in theatres, and then they got had this idea, and they've taken that right through. And so look that up, have a little look. But yeah, that's so research, innovation, mental health. I've met a few ODPs recently, and more recently, working in mental health in ECT, managing services actually in ECT, not just working in them. And again, that started by going out on a rota, just working in those areas, getting interested in it, enjoying that element of the role, and then taking it further and just pushing the boundaries a little bit. So when people say an ODP can't do that, they say, why not? They ask the question why. And now, that lady that I'm talking about, I think she's in the Midlands, is now leading and managing that service. I again met a chap fairly recently who's hugely involved in pre-assessment. Took an opportunity a good number of years ago, but he leads all the exercise testing during pre-assessment. and that whole service as well. So bringing our patients in and making sure that they are fit and ready for surgery. So in terms of research, innovation, clinical, obviously there's lots of lecturers around, lots of opportunities for education. And then in terms of leadership, there's been, well, again, I'll talk about this in a little while, but the national role for operating department practice in terms of education and leadership. We've had lots of fellowships and fellow posts for ODPs, both regional and more local. And then there's a number of AHP roles, either sort of within a faculty or within a region or in a trust, that are leadership roles. And again, not just for ODPs, usually across AHPs. Yeah, all the way up to execs, which is great.
I think my favourite part of that was where you said, when they turned around and said around the opportunity, and it was like, well, why not? Why, just because
Yeah.
I'm an ODP, why not? Why
Yeah.
can't I? And I think that's so true. And I think one of the things that sometimes I do get working in admissions, where sometimes people are a little bit unsure around the profession, and they think, oh, is it just in theatres? I went, well, the majority of the work is in theatres, but there's so much scope to really get out there. So no, thank you for sharing that.
So just on that, I think, if we change the narrative a little bit, so it's why, ODPs can, rather than, in those 20 years that I've been in the profession, it's been very much ODPs can't give drugs, ODPs can't do pre-assessment, ODPs can't do this. Actually, as a profession, we need to change that narrative. Yes, we can do it, and this is how we're doing it. And again, I've been in that really privileged position to see, and it's different up and down the country, but to see how ODPs are doing it and how ODPs are changing things, and contributing to care and using the right skills, like you said earlier, the skills that they've got, we are as able to do that as any other AHP. So
Lovely, thank you. So you kind of touched a little bit about that you said you were going to explore a little bit more around your own experiences. So can you tell me about your experiences of working outside of the perioperative environment?
Yeah, sure. So like I say, I started 20 years ago, and worked clinically, and I've worked clinically all that time. It's actually only very recently that I've not held a clinical contract. It feels a little bit, I'm a bit uncomfortable with it at the moment, so I'll probably end up getting a contract somewhere. But my experience was in obstetrics and in neurosurgery. So vast majority of that early experience was sort of front loaded in theatre, in peri-op. But I was really lucky in neuro to be able to do patient transfers. So yes, peri-op related, but we used to transfer patients from one hospital to another alongside our paramedics and our anaesthetic colleagues for stereotactic radiosurgery. So essentially cancer services. And yeah, it was mostly paediatric patients, and it was a really, really great thing to do. I got to meet the parents of the children as well, and look after the children through that journey. So whilst it was linked peri-op, we would go through MRI, we would go through potentially CT, angio, and then, like I say, transfer them in the ambulance to the cancer hospital. So that was probably my first bit of experience outside peri-op. And then I didn't mean to fall into it, but I very much started taking on students early on. Enjoyed teaching, enjoyed having students, and very early on did sort of that mentorship training. And then, yeah, I sort of approached the university. Again, sort of, if you don't ask, you don't get. Approached the university and spoke to them about my experience before actually coming onto the course, and whether I could utilise some of those skills to do a bit of teaching. So I started as an associate lecturer, specialist visiting lecturer, and then subsequently, again, not really thinking too much about it, but I really enjoyed that. And when a post came up, decided that I would join the team full time, and managed and was successful with that. So that sort of was the start of my career, and I think I was really fortunate that I got support to then do a master's in healthcare education, and worked at Sheffield Hallam University for 10 years, doing lots of different roles, supporting students, but also looking at placements, and then looking a bit more outwardly into, I liked looking at to see kind of how health education England at that point kind of fit with our courses and whatnot. So, and then I got to that point. I'd had children, and I got to that point where I really wanted a bit more of a challenge or something different, really, not necessarily more of a challenge, but something different. And a post came up at a local trust to lead placements for the trust across the whole of nursing, midwifery, and AHP. And what I hadn't done before was have direct leadership, so line management of people. So it was actually quite a strategic move for me to go and do that. And again, was fortunate. I had a team. I think I had one AHP in that team, but again, a really nice diverse team of people who were clinical, non-clinical, managed that team and placements. And again, that was during COVID. So we had multiple challenges, and because of those challenges, then I linked with Health Education England, as was, which then led to the opportunity of project work, which I took on. So yeah, I worked with NHSE on projects. I worked with I then left the trust and worked with NHSE full time as part of the Centre for Education and Training, which was a national role. So I was scoping the profession, and then that became more of a leadership role, where I was leading education and training in England alongside the National Allied Health Professions team. So again, that's where that privilege really comes in, to see that sort of bird's eye view of the profession. And it was absolutely brilliant working with that team. Learnt ever such a lot about me and how that works up there.
So quite a lot that you covered there, Helen. So at any point did you face any challenges? And if you did, how did you overcome them?
Yeah, there's always bumps along the road, isn't there? I think I think actually the career change going from clinical into becoming a lecturer full time was quite a shock, actually. And I remember just a random conversation with sort of one of the deans, actually, on an open day at the university after I'd been here for about 6 months. And I said, I don't know whether I've made the right career move. It feels very different at the university to being in clinical. I'm missing my patients. And she actually said, yeah, it is. She was very straight, that it is very different, and it is for some people and it's not for others. I felt like from that conversation, I sort of stuck with it. But what I did do was I was able to work a little bit outside in my own time, clinical. So I was getting that patient contact. I was still having that teamwork because that was important to me from a clinical perspective. And then I carried on doing the day job, and that was fine. Loved that. That was a great balance for me. Bit of extra cash coming in at that point in my life. But then I had children, and that changes things massively. So having one child didn't change things hugely, but having a second child really did. And having the time to be able to do 2 jobs and raise 2 children, it just doesn't happen. So things changed, I think, for me. And as you know, working at a university, it's not a shift and it finishes and that's it. You're always working, you're always thinking, you've got those emails coming through. Yeah. So yeah, those were definitely a couple of the sort of those earlier challenges. I think one thing that someone had a conversation with me once about imposter syndrome. Have you heard of imposter syndrome?
Oh yeah, definitely. I something when I first started at SHU, I definitely had the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, that feeling of you shouldn't be here, or and I think everybody gets that at some point. I think for me in my late 30s, early 40s, it was there, but I was kind of ignoring it, and I just got on with stuff because I was passionate about it. And then someone had a conversation about imposter syndrome, and I'd never called it that. And as soon as they said what it was, I was like, oh my God, I've got that. And then everywhere that you go, or the new things that you do, you start to question it. So it wasn't the most helpful conversation, but it has been helpful in terms of then me leading others and supporting others to develop, because we all get that, and we all get that at different times and for different reasons as well. Um, and yeah, so it's just, I found that just talking about that with my line managers and friends and family just helped, because, like I say, it's not just me as an individual that gets it. So
I think you're right in relation to the imposter syndrome aspect. For me, when it was really like sort of brought to my attention when I just started this role, during my PGCE, so my postgrad certificate in higher education, it was a topic that we had in the classroom, and I was surrounded by all these other people. So on my course, it was loads of other people from Sheffield Hallam, from many different areas of practice, not just health and areas of practice outside of that, and business. And it was interesting to listen to each other's stories, how we all felt the same regardless of our experiences, and therefore I think I found a good moment in that where I felt like I opened up to them, and therefore
yeah,
it was like, oh, it's not just me, everyone gets this.
yeah, I think it's good to share it, and I think it's good to acknowledge it for yourself, because what that means is that you care, doesn't it? At the end of the day, if you get an imposter
Absolutely.
syndrome, it means that you care, and that you care for what you're doing, you're passionate about it, and you want to do the right thing. So, I think it should be called something else. I haven't thought of a name for it, because, but should be something else. And yeah, so that was one thing. And then the other thing, I guess, was that, and again, this probably links to this what we've just been talking about. But if I'd have remained ignorant to imposter syndrome, I probably wouldn't be feeling it as much as, or at least won't be able to, say what it was. That incompetence, unconscious incompetence, kind of that not knowing what you don't know. And again, certainly moving from a clinical career to an academic career, that was a huge thing. Not knowing systems, processes, just the general day-to-day stuff that can be quite frustrating and makes your day job a lot harder. But yeah, I think not knowing what you don't know is difficult, and I think therefore, like, the way of overcoming that for me is just talking to people, really, and getting to know people, and people are your best source, and will help you to get through that.
Brilliant, thank you. So what sort of so we've identified potential challenges that you might face, but what positive experiences did you have from working outside of theatres?
Oh my gosh, loads.
Pick me
What?
two.
Positive experiences. I think, well, the most recent one comes to mind first, and that would be the connections that I've made across the country. And again, being in that privileged position, it's funny how, I'm just me, I'm just Helen, and I'm working in a national role, but you get introduced as the national lead for ODP for England, and it's like you're suddenly on this, I don't know, pedestal or whatever. And I've always been, well, I hope I am, down to earth, but you do have to be mindful then when you're working at that level, how you come across, and how people take you, I guess, as that leader. But I was so lucky to have fantastic managers, coaches, really, rather than managers, people who were, massively inspirational, who were very, very good at their jobs, and just there for me when I needed them, but also connected me into their groups. It was none of this sort of holding your cards close to your chest. It was all about sharing, connecting, and that's really, the work that I did initially with HEE, and where we got to in terms of progress for the profession. It was absolutely not down to me. It was absolutely down to us all working together and connecting. So I would say, the positives is meeting some really inspirational people, but also just seeing how great the ODP network is when, when we can get people together and we can connect people. And it is still a little bit of a challenge, but it's there, and we're all there, and we're all working hard, and there's some great people doing some great things in lots of different places. So
Brilliant.
so that was that's definitely sort of a really good experience.
Lovely, thank you. So my next question for you is, especially for any of the listeners that listening, so what advice would you give to an ODP looking at applying for an opportunity that's outside of that perioperative environment, specifically for, let's say, an area where ODPs you'd not typically find ODPs?
Yeah, just go for it. If you've got the skills to do it, even if you're thinking when you're looking at the person spec, oh, I'm not sure whether I have, just pick the phone up, talk to people, ask. It was the best conversations I had when I was recruiting people was with people who weren't sure, and then as you talk to them and they open up about their experiences, you're like, well, we can put that down to experience. So you might not have something that's on paper, but you've got the experience. And I think for ODPs that's really important, because we know that the ODPs as a profession hasn't necessarily had the opportunities that other professions have. We're still emerging, particularly around research and leadership. And so just get out there, get talking to people, and be bold. Push the boundaries a little bit. And as I said earlier, if you don't ask, they can only say no, can't they? And then you can ask why after that.
Exactly. You could say, why not?
Yeah,
exactly.
And keep saying why not? Yeah, it's
like a toddler, really. Like when a toddler just goes, why? That's what we need to do to really push ourselves.
Absolutely. Or I was like that when I was a kid, and my kids are the same. So, and I still do it now. Because if people can't give you a decent reason, or then for me, the doors are open. So I think definitely getting in there, being bold, stepping out your comfort zone. It's a hard thing to do, but absolutely if you do that, your achievement just feels so much better, doesn't it, and greater. And I think then, I guess, on the sort of sensible side of things, just think, what is it? In fact, have a bit of a 2-year plan, have a bit of a 5-year plan. Is it in 5 years' time I want to have a family, and actually I'm just going to sit my career here for a bit, or is it that actually in 5 years' time I want to be a professor, or I want to have my PhD? How are you going to get to that point? Who are you going to have the conversations with to support you along the way in terms of those career conversations, so that in those 5 years, when you look back, you can see that growth, rather than thinking, oh God, I'm still where I was before. And there are people out there who have done that and that can do that. And I think for us as a profession, it's really important that we learn from other professions, be it nursing and midwifery. Nursing has been around for years and years and years, more so than our profession, I guess, in its current state. And from the other allied health professions, because we've got a lot to learn from them as well. So yeah, a little bit strategic, thinking about what is it that you need, but then just being bold and going for it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's all about like your own personal interests and having that opportunity to sort of create that plan. I think what you could have done, actually, because I had a 10-year plan after I left university, and I don't know whether you gave me that same advice that you've just given there.
Right, did I? Maybe.
I always wondered where it had come from, but I think I'd always had the plan to I want to be an ODP, and then it came towards the end of my training when I was very much like, oh, hold on, I've done it. I've done what I wanted. What's next?
Yeah.
And I sort of sat and it took me a while, but I sat down and I was like, right, okay, I definitely want to go into education, and I knew that that's where I wanted to go. So I then drove a lot of opportunities and created some opportunities, any opportunities that came my way, I went for that were related to that, so that then I could look back, and if I'm thinking now in the 10-year plan that I had, I'm achieving it and I'm doing pretty well. So, and it gives you focus, it gives you drive, and I think that's some really good advice. So thank you.
And I also think, I thought very much that careers were quite linear. You climb the ladder and they're not, are they? And again, in my role with NHS England, I was exposed to so many different professions. Well, the whole of the 15 AHPs, and again, learning from them. There was this theory, I don't know whether you've heard it before, called the Kawa model. I think it's KAWA, and it's like this river model. And I really like that theory of maybe some sideways moves. The landscape's going to change, and so you might have to flex and accommodate. There'll be some boulders, in the way, and all that sort of stuff that you don't notice downriver that you're going to have to, overcome. So yeah, just be a bit strategic. Have that grounding there so that you've got it, and then just get support as well. I don't think we use each other enough in our roles, and our managers and our coaches to support us in our career conversations.
Brilliant. Some really good advice. Thank you. And my next question for you is, where do you see the profession in the future outside of those theatre doors?
I could
Where
talk about
do you
it
think
forever.
you could be?
How long have we got? There's the fundamental thing, isn't there? Our roots and our skills are always going to be in theatre. Our histories obviously in theatre, and I think we need to maintain the numbers in theatre. So again, we need to work with bodies like NHS England and the long-term workforce plan and the universities to make sure that we're pulling lots of students through and into those roles and giving lots of opportunities. Because the good thing about our profession is that actually we're pretty good at kind of that widening access, different opportunities coming in through different routes. If you look at some of the stats by the HCPC, we're quite different to maybe some of the other allied health. So we're a really diverse profession now as well, and we've changed quite significantly because we are predominantly a female, depending on age groups, but predominantly female profession now. So there's something around that, and people may be doing some research into that. But with that, there's different needs of the profession, but there's also lots of different opportunities opening up. So things like the long-term workforce plan, that's got some specific directives in it for ODPs to do, but also our elective recovery, again, optimal use of ODPs. And this is what I used to do in meetings. I used to be like, can an ODP do that? An ODP could do that. And it's not just for nursing. We love our nursing colleagues. We value them. We love them. But an ODP could be trained to do that in just the same way, or has the fundamental skills already through the program. So I think, again, myth busting for us is really important to make sure that people know what we can do and how well we do it. But yeah, so elective recovery, loads of opportunity with, again, prehabilitation, pre-assessment, getting our patients ready for surgery, and I think we've got opportunities coming in terms of the College of Operating Department Practitioners, the CODP, renewing our curriculum. We've got new standards of proficiency, haven't we? That are already in practice, and then the revised standards of conduct, performance, and ethics that have just come through. So again, those have all changed slightly. So I think there's opportunities there. I'd love to see more ODPs going into pre-assessment, because having worked as a support worker before I did operating department practice, I used to take out drains and things like that, and I never understood how they'd been placed, what they were for, or I just used to literally pull them. I was trained to just pull them out, really, and if something went wrong, to get a nurse in a sterile manner, obviously. But that was really helpful then, when actually I said, can I follow this patient down to theatre and see? And then they came back up with the drain. And I said, that's where it's placed. That's why it's there. And I think in terms of pre-assessment, ODPs have got so much knowledge of what happens in theatre. So in terms of supporting our patients coming through with, across the physical health, the mental health, all of that sort of stuff, we just got so much to give. So I'd love to see that area sort of develop. And then there was two other things that I was thinking of, which were the satellite sort of centres. So with elective recovery, we've got a lot more sort of smaller places doing a lot more high volume turnover patients. And for me, there's always patients that'll have complications. So not only can we manage those centres and oversee those centres, but we can also, I think there's probably going to be more opportunity to do patient transfers, either when things go wrong or when there's, patients just need to be transferred back and forward. So again, well, we know, and we've got colleagues that have worked, in Helimed and those sort of HEMS services, but those and with our paramedic staff as well, those teams. So the last thing is the AHP Critical Care Capability Framework, which has just been published last year. And Giles Farrington was leading that for the profession. So he's an ODP who actually came to the Sheffield Hallam conference last year, and he's been leading that with a group of allied health. So COVID really raised the bar for us, and the profession, raised the bar during COVID and really shone a light on what we could do and those critical care skills. So some places in the country have really taken to that, and there's ODPs working in critical care as part of a rota system, or working in theatres and critical care, and then other places haven't quite taken to it. So again, it's sharing those sorts of things, and I think we'll see more ODPs now having the support actually to go and do the courses to develop and work in critical care or critical care areas. We always have this discussion, Giles and I, about whether it's a place or kind of a philosophy, and critical care is a patient that needs critical care, isn't it? It doesn't have to be a place, it could be anywhere.
Yeah, lovely. No, thank you. I think some really good points that you made, especially around how to develop the aspects of the curriculum to support future ODPs, and I think it's so key. I was quite fortunate with my previous experiences. Before I did my training, I was a clinical support worker on a ward. I therefore then utilised that, and I used to pick up NHSP shifts in many different areas whilst I was training, and I think that then helped me develop as a practitioner, because there wasn't an area that I ever went to that my knowledge couldn't be improved by. And I think even when I was working with the tissue viability nurses, when I was working in, even down to working in a sort of like a dementia specialist ward, all of that developed my own skills for my profession. So any opportunity will help us in the future when we are looking into roles that are predominantly outside of that perioperative environment.
Absolutely, and I guess for anyone listening to this, who is thinking about a career as an ODP and hasn't got any experience, I would say go and do something in a care setting. You don't have to do it paid. You could do it voluntary. But yeah, I was a support worker for 3 or 4 years before. I was on a bank in the end. I was on a ward to start with, and that was good because it gave me a real grounding. And then I was on the bank when I was doing something else, and just those fundamental skills, that communication, that personal care, that connectivity with a patient, cleaning down beds, taking obs, all of that lot, just really again, going into then training just made that transition so much easier. So I would definitely advise people to just do that.
Perfect, thank you. So thank you very much for your time today. I've learned a lot during this, so I'm sure our listeners will have learned a lot. I have, yeah. So to sort of summarise on sort of this interview, what do you think the takeaway message is for our listeners?
Takeaway message.
Put you on the spot now, sorry.
That's all right. Myth bust about our profession, that ODPs can change the narrative. ODPs can be bold and be brave, and a little bit strategic.
Perfect, thank you very much. So much for listening to us at the ODP Cast. We hope that you've enjoyed it, and please remember to save, add it to your library so that you can keep up to date with us. To get involved, follow us at ODP Shoe across all major social media networks. Whether you're listening on your way to work, whether you've got a coffee, or you're just waiting for the patient to be brought down to the anaesthetic room, don't forget to give us a like so that you can see what we're up to next time on the ODP Cast.